Behind the closed doors of the mayor's grand house, where their family is hailed as the epitome of perfection, a 12-year-old girl silently endures a hidden torment, facing a nightly nightmare, a dark secret that could shake the entire town to its core. The party was at its peak, the living room brimming with townspeople laughing and drinking, each of them eager to rub shoulders with the man they believed would be their next mayor. Damien was the star of the evening, charming and ever so gallant, his smile a polished weapon that cut through any doubts about his character. A man of the people, they called him, a devoted family man. But under the surface of his practiced demeanor, there was something rotten, something twisted. Isabella stood by the edge of the room, her fingers nervously picking at the fabric of her dress. At only 12 years old, she had already learned to dread these parties. She had already learned what it meant when Damien glanced at her with those eyes, the ones that made her feel like prey. Tonight, he was dressed in his finest suit, his tie a deep crimson that matched the hunger in his gaze as it settled on her from across the room. She wanted to disappear, to be anywhere but here. Lydia moved through the crowd, her face a mask of calmness and grace, but inside, she was a mess of nerves. Damien had become more vicious lately, more cutting with his words. He was no longer hiding his disdain for her aging appearance, for her inability to give him children of his own. "Look at you," he'd sneer, "not even a shadow of the woman I married." His words, always whispered with venom, had worn her down to the point where she felt like a ghost in her own home. But tonight, she had to play the part of the perfect wife, the supportive spouse of the future mayor. Damien approached Isabella, a false smile plastered on his face as he exchanged pleasantries with the guests nearby. His hand snaked around Isabella's waist, pulling her close in what appeared to be a fatherly embrace. But she knew better. She felt his fingers dig into her side, felt the way his thumb traced circles on her lower back. Moving down slowly, deliberately, she stiffened, her body going rigid as a stone. "You're growing up so beautifully, my dear," he murmured into her ear, his voice low and dangerous. His hand slipped lower, squeezing her behind in a way that made her skin crawl. He was touching her in full view of everyone, hidden in plain sight by the mask of parental affection. She bit her lip, trying to suppress a whimper. "Stay still," he whispered, his fingers moving boldly, feeling, groping. "Or do you want me to make a scene?" Isabella's eyes darted around the room, but no one was looking at them. They were all too caught up in their own conversations, too eager to be close to Damien to notice the disgust on her face, the terror in her eyes. She wanted to scream, to shove him away, but his grip tightened as if he sensed her resistance. "You think you can run from me?" His breath was hot against her ear. "You're mine. Remember that. Every inch of you is mine." She bit back a sob, her hands shaking at her sides. She had learned the hard way what happened when she resisted. The bruises on her arms and thighs were still fresh, a painful reminder of the consequences. When she had tried to fight him off last week, he had slammed her against the wall, his eyes cold and unforgiving. "Do you want me to hurt you, Isabella?" he had hissed. "Because I can, and I will." Damien's public persona slipped seamlessly back into place as he spotted Lydia across the room. He raised a hand in greeting, a warm smile spreading across his face, the perfect husband. But even from here, Lydia could see the difference. She could see the way his hand gripped Isabella's shoulder, the way her daughter flinched under his touch. "Is everything all right?" a woman asked, interrupting her thoughts. Lydia forced herself to nod. "Yes, of course, everything's perfect," she lied, her eyes never leaving the sight of Damien and Isabella. There was something about the way he touched her that made bile rise in her throat. Something wasn't right. Something was very wrong. Damien's hand slipped away from Isabella, but not before giving her a final, lingering squeeze. He moved back into the crowd, his predatory gaze now masked by a facade of congeniality. Isabella stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, a storm of emotions raging inside her: fear, anger, shame. She turned her head slightly, catching a glimpse of Lydia watching her with a concerned expression. For a brief moment, she felt a flicker of hope, but it quickly died as she saw Damien's eyes narrow, a silent warning. Isabella lowered her gaze, her fists clenching at her sides. She couldn't risk it. She couldn't tell anyone. Damien's words echoed in her mind. "One word to anyone, and I'll make sure you and your mother wish you'd never been born." Lydia approached them hesitantly after the guests had dispersed, her eyes searching Isabella's face for answers. "Isabella, are you okay? You look pale," she said softly, reaching out to touch her daughter's arm. But Isabella pulled away, her eyes darting toward Damien, who was now watching them with a thinly veiled look of malice. "She's fine," Damien interjected smoothly, stepping between them with that charming smile that made everyone adore him. "She's just tired. Aren't you, sweetheart?" Isabella nodded mutely, her voice stolen by fear. Damien's hand slid behind her again, a possessive gesture that made Lydia's stomach twist with unease. "You should rest," Lydia said, trying to sound gentle but failing to hide the tremor in her voice. "Go to your room, Isabella." Isabella didn't need to be told twice. She hurried down the hallway, each step feeling like she was trying to escape quicksand. As she closed the door behind her, she let out a shaky breath, sliding down to the floor, her small frame trembling with suppressed sobs. The guests had finally left, and the Sanchez house, once filled with laughter and clinking glasses, had fallen into an unsettling silence. Lydia stood alone in front of the full-length mirror, examining herself. She wore a dress that she had saved for a special occasion, a shimmering blue gown that hugged her figure in all the right places. For a brief moment, she felt beautiful, almost like her younger self, before time and Damien's cutting words had taken their toll. She tilted her head, smiling faintly at her reflection. It was rare for her to feel this way, to see herself as something more than the object of her husband's disdain. But tonight, she thought, maybe things could be different. Maybe Damien would look at her and see the woman he once loved. "Admiring yourself, are you?" Damien's voice cut through her thoughts like a knife, cold and sharp. She turned, startled, to find him leaning against the doorframe, his eyes glinting with something dark. I just thought I looked nice," she stammered, feeling foolish under his scrutinizing gaze. He snorted, a sound that was neither amused nor kind. "Nice?" he echoed, his lips curling into a sneer. "Lydia, you're deluding yourself. You look pathetic, clinging to this fantasy that you still have your looks. Let's not forget why we had to adopt Isabella in the first place. You couldn't even give me a child of my own." The words struck her like a blow, and she turned back to the mirror, unable to look at him, unable to bear the truth in his voice. How many times had he thrown that in her face? That she was barren, useless, an empty shell of a woman. Tears stung at her eyes, but she blinked them away. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Damien moved closer, his footsteps echoing in the room as he approached. She braced herself for another verbal assault, but instead he reached out and gently took her hand. His touch was surprisingly tender, and it sent a confusing rush of emotions through her. "You look tired," he said softly, almost kindly. "It's been a long night. Here." He handed her a glass of orange juice, his eyes softening with a hint of concern. "Drink this. It'll help you relax." Lydia stared at the glass, feeling a flicker of hope ignite in her chest. Maybe he did care, in his own way. Maybe he was trying to make amends for the harsh words. She offered him a small, tentative smile and took the glass from his hand. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Damien watched her, his gaze inscrutable, as she lifted the glass to her lips and drank. The juice was cool and sweet, and she felt an odd sense of warmth spread through her as she swallowed. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. But the warmth quickly turned to a heavy, drowsy feeling, and Lydia blinked, suddenly overwhelmed by a wave of exhaustion. Her limbs grew heavy and her eyelids fluttered as the room began to spin. I think I need to lie down," she mumbled, swaying on her feet. Damien caught her, his arms encircling her waist with a grip that was almost too firm. "Of course, my dear," he murmured, guiding her to the bed. "Just lie down and rest. You've had a long day." Lydia collapsed onto the mattress, her head spinning, her vision blurring. She wanted to fight the sleep that was pulling her under, wanted to stay awake, to hold on to the fleeting feeling of being cared for. But it was no use. The darkness swallowed her whole, and she sank into a deep, dreamless sleep. Damien watched her for a moment, his face impassive as he leaned over her sleeping form. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering on her cheek in a gesture that could almost be mistaken for tenderness. But then his lips twisted into a smirk, and he straightened, turning away from the bed without a backward glance. "Sleep tight," he muttered under his breath, his voice dripping with contempt. He walked out of the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click. In the darkness of the hallway, he moved silently, his steps soundless on the carpeted floor. He made his way to the end of the corridor, to the door that stood slightly ajar. Isabella's room. He pushed the door open, slipping inside like a shadow. Isabella was asleep, her small body curled up under the blankets, her face peaceful in the dim light. Damien's eyes roamed over her, a hunger burning in his gaze as he approached the bed. He reached out, covering her mouth with his hand, stifling the scream that rose in her throat as she woke with a start. Her eyes flew open, wide and terrified, and she struggled against him, her small hands pushing at his chest. But he was too strong, too determined. "Shh," he whispered, his voice a venomous hiss in the dark. "Be quiet, or you'll wake your mother. We wouldn't want that, would we?" Isabella's heart pounded in her chest, panic flooding her veins as she realized who it was. Her father, her protector, the man who was supposed to love her. But the way he was looking at her, the way his hand was clamped over her mouth, told her everything she needed to know. He was no protector. He was a monster. He moved his hand from her mouth, his fingers trailing down her neck, across her collarbone. "You looked so beautiful tonight," he murmured, his voice thick with something dark and twisted. "You did this on purpose, didn't you? Teasing me, tempting me." Isabella shook her head frantically, tears spilling from her eyes as she tried to push him away. "No," she whimpered, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, don't." But he ignored her, his hands moving lower, slipping under the hem of her nightgown, sliding up her legs, her stomach. She gasped, her body going rigid with fear as his fingers explored her, violated her. "You want this," he breathed, his lips brushing against her ear. "You want me. That's why you dress like that. Why you look at me the way you do. You're begging for it." She writhed under him, desperate to get away, to make it stop, but he was too strong, his weight pinning her down, his hands relentless as they roamed her body. In a surge of panic, she bit down on his hand, sinking her teeth into his flesh. He jerked back with a snarl, his eyes flashing with fury as he raised his hand and struck her across the face. The force of the blow sent her head snapping to the side, stars bursting in her vision as pain exploded in her cheek. "You little bitch," he spat, grabbing her by the hair and yanking her head back. "You think you can fight me? You think you can get away?" She whimpered, her hands clutching at his wrist as he dragged her up, his grip like iron. "Please," she begged, her voice hoarse with fear. "Please. Stop!" He laughed, a low, cruel sound that sent chills down her spine. "You want to scream, don't you?" he taunted, his hand tightening in her hair. "Go ahead, scream. Call for your mommy. She won't hear you. She's sleeping like a baby, thanks to me." Damien's eyes darkened, a cruel glint appearing as he leaned closer. "Listen to me," he hissed, his voice filled with malice. "You ever think about telling anyone about this, and I swear I will make your mother pay. I'll make her life a living hell, and then I'll come for you." Damien shoved her back onto the bed, his eyes gleaming with sick pleasure as he loomed over her. "You're going to learn to be a good little girl," he said, his voice soft and deadly. "You're going to learn to obey me, and if you don't, I'll make sure you regret it." Damien's eyes gleamed in the darkened room as he loomed over Isabella, his weight pressing down on her, trapping her in place. Her breath came in ragged, panicked gasps, her body trembling beneath him. She had thought tonight would be different, that she could avoid this, but he had waited, biding his time until he could catch her alone. And now, here he was, his hand over her mouth, his hot breath on her face, a twisted smile curling his lips. "Such a pretty little thing," he murmured, his voice low and dangerous. "You know what you're doing, don't you? Dressing up like that at the party, acting all innocent." His hand moved lower, trailing down her neck, her shoulder, lingering on her chest. "You want this, don't you? Teasing me like that." Isabella tried to scream, tried to twist away from him, but his grip tightened, his fingers digging into her skin like claws. "No, no," she whimpered against his palm, her voice muffled, her eyes wide with terror. Her heart stopped, fear crashing through her like a tidal wave. He smirked, sensing her terror, feeding off it. "I know people," he continued, his voice a low, menacing whisper. "People who can make problems disappear, who can make sure neither of you ever see the light of day again. You understand me, Isabella?" She nodded frantically, her eyes filling with tears. He watched her for a moment, relishing in her fear before removing his hand from her mouth. She gasped for breath, her body shaking uncontrollably. "Good girl," he whispered, his fingers trailing down her arm, sending a shiver of revulsion through her. "You're going to be a good little girl and do exactly what I say. And maybe, just maybe, I'll let you and your mother live in peace." Her stomach churned, bile rising in her throat as his hand continued its journey over her body. He slid it beneath her nightgown, his touch invasive, violating. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the feeling, trying to disappear into herself. But it was impossible. Damien's breath was hot against her ear as he spoke, his words dripping with perversion. "I'm not going to ruin you tonight," he said, his voice soft but laced with cruelty. "Not yet. You're not quite ready for that. But one day you will be, and when that day comes, you'll wish you had learned to behave." Isabella lay there, her body frozen in place, tears streaming down her face as he touched her. He took his time, his hands exploring, squeezing, groping. He seemed to take pleasure in her silence, in her fear, each sob that she swallowed only fueling his sadistic pleasure. "Such a good girl," he murmured, his lips brushing against her neck. "Obedient. That's what I like about you. Unlike your useless mother." She bit her lip, holding back a scream as his hands continued their vile exploration. She wanted to fight, to claw at him, to make him stop. But the memory of his threats, the image of her mother suffering, kept her still, kept her silent. She couldn't risk it. She couldn't let him hurt her mother. Eventually, he grew bored, his hands withdrawing as he sat up, looking down at her with a twisted smile. "Remember," he said, his voice soft and menacing, "one word to anyone, and you'll both pay. Understood?" Isabella nodded, unable to speak, her voice trapped in her throat. He chuckled, a low, dark sound that sent chills down her spine. "That's my girl," he whispered, planting a cold, mocking kiss on her forehead before standing up and leaving the room. She lay there for a moment, too stunned, too broken to move. Her body felt numb, her skin crawling with the memory of his touch. She wanted to scream, to cry out, but the fear, the horror of what he had said, kept her silent. When she finally managed to sit up, her body ached with every movement. She felt filthy, defiled, like she would never be clean again. The tears came then, hot and silent, burning tracks down her cheeks as she stumbled out of bed and made her way to the bathroom. The sight of herself in the mirror made her stomach turn. Her face was pale, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She could still feel his hands on her, still hear his voice in her ear, taunting her, threatening her. She tore her eyes away from the mirror, reaching for the shower handle with trembling fingers. She cranked the water to its hottest setting, stepping under the scalding stream without hesitation. The water burned her skin, turning it red, but it still wasn't enough. She needed to get him off her, needed to wash away the filth, the horror. She grabbed the soap, scrubbing at her skin with a ferocity that bordered on madness. She scrubbed and scrubbed, her nails digging into her flesh, her skin turning raw and red. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't wash him away. He was there, under her skin, in her mind, a stain she would never be able to remove. Isabella sank to the floor of the shower, her arms wrapped around her knees as she sobbed uncontrollably. The water pounded down on her cold now, but she didn't care. She couldn't feel anything anymore. All she could do was cry, to release the terror, the revulsion, the utter despair that had settled into her bones. She sat there for what felt like hours, the water turning ice cold, her tears mingling with the spray. She hugged herself tightly, rocking back and forth, trying to hold herself together, to not fall apart completely. In the back of her mind, Damien's threats echoed, a constant reminder of the danger that loomed over her and her mother. She had to stay quiet. She had to keep this secret, or he would destroy them both. Eventually, the water ran out, leaving her shivering on the floor of the shower. She reached up with trembling hands, turning off the faucet and climbing to her feet. Her body ached, every part of her screaming with pain, but she forced herself to move, to get dressed. She slipped into her nightgown, her fingers shaking as she buttoned it up. She couldn't bring herself to look in the mirror again, couldn't face the sight of the girl she had become. Instead, she crawled back into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, closing her eyes tightly. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, felt his hands on her, heard his voice in her ear. She was trapped in this nightmare, with no escape, no way out. She lay there, wide awake, the darkness pressing in on her, suffocating her. Isabella knew then that this was only the beginning, that there would be more nights like this, more threats, more touches, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She was alone in this, and the only thing she could do was endure it. For her mother, for herself. She closed her eyes again, a single tear slipping down her cheek as she whispered a silent prayer into the darkness. A prayer for strength, for courage, for something to change. But deep down, she knew the truth, that there was no one coming to save her, that she was on her own, trapped in a house with a monster who called himself her father. The morning after, the sun rose in Almendros, casting a golden light that seeped through the curtains and danced across the bedroom floor. Lydia stirred, blinking against the brightness, a dull ache settling in her head. Her thoughts were sluggish, muddled, as if she'd been drugged. She frowned, trying to piece together the events of the previous night, but her mind was foggy, the details slipping through her grasp like sand. She remembered the party, the smiles and laughter, Damien's charm on full display. He had been the perfect host, the perfect husband. They had toasted to his campaign, to their family. And then her hand reached up to touch her face as if searching for some trace of the cold disdain she thought she had seen in his eyes. But there was nothing. Just her own reflection, pale and uncertain, staring back at her from the mirror. With a sigh, she pushed herself up and glanced at the clock. It was late, much later than she usually slept. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet hitting the cool floor, and forced herself to stand. She needed to check on Isabella. She made her way down the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. The door to Isabella's room was slightly ajar, and Lydia hesitated, a strange sense of foreboding creeping over her. She pushed the door open gently and peered inside. Isabella was sitting on her bed, her knees drawn up to her chest, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "Isabella?" Lydia called softly, stepping into the room. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" Isabella flinched at the sound of her voice, her body tensing, as if she had been caught doing something wrong. She didn't look up, didn't respond, just stared down at her hands, her face a mask of fear and misery. Lydia's heart twisted painfully in her chest. She crossed the room slowly, lowering herself onto the edge of the bed, reaching out to touch her daughter's shoulder. "Isabella, what's wrong? Talk to me." But Isabella pulled away, shrinking from her touch as if it burned. "I'm fine," she mumbled, her voice hollow and distant. I didn't sleep well." Lydia frowned, her eyes scanning Isabella's face for any sign of what was troubling her. She had been distant lately, skittish, as if she was afraid of something. But every time Lydia tried to get her to talk, she would shut down, retreating further into herself. "Is it school?" Lydia probed gently. "Or something else? You know you can tell me anything, right?" Isabella's eyes flickered briefly, a flash of something raw and painful crossing her face before she quickly looked away. "I said I'm fine," she repeated, more firmly this time. "I just need to be alone." Lydia opened her mouth to protest, to push for more answers. But the look in Isabella's eyes stopped her cold. There was a terror there, a deep, soul-crushing fear that made her blood run cold. What was happening to her little girl? What had caused this change, this distance? With a heavy heart, Lydia nodded and stood up. "Okay," she said softly. "But if you need me, I'm here. Always." Isabella didn't respond, didn't even look at her as she left the room. Lydia closed the door quietly behind her, feeling a wave of helplessness wash over her. She stood there for a moment, her hand on the doorknob, trying to make sense of what was happening. Something was wrong. She knew it in her gut. But what? What could possibly make Isabella so afraid, so withdrawn? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs. She turned and saw Damien approaching, his expression smooth and unreadable. He was dressed impeccably as always, every inch the perfect man, the perfect father. But there was something in his eyes, something dark and predatory, that made her stomach twist with unease. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice calm, almost soothing. "I heard you talking to Isabella. Is she not feeling well?" Lydia forced a smile, trying to mask her discomfort. "She's just a bit upset," she said carefully. "I think she might be coming down with something." Damien's gaze flickered to the closed door behind her, his lips curving into a faint smile. "I'm sure she'll be fine," he said smoothly. "She just needs some rest." There was something in the way he said it, in the way his eyes lingered on the door, that sent a shiver down Lydia's spine. She didn't know what it was, but it felt wrong, off. Like there was something he wasn't telling her, something he was hiding. She watched him for a moment, trying to read his expression, but his face was a mask of calm. He reached out and touched her cheek, a gesture that should have been comforting, but instead made her skin crawl. "You look tired," he murmured, his thumb brushing over her skin. "You should rest too." Lydia nodded mutely, feeling a chill settle in her bones as he pulled away. She turned and walked down the hallway, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. What was happening to her family? What was happening to Isabella? Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the house grew thicker, more suffocating with each passing day. Isabella avoided her, darting out of rooms whenever Lydia entered, always keeping a safe distance. She wore long sleeves and high collars, even in the warm weather, as if she was hiding something. And whenever Damien was near, her whole body would go rigid, her eyes downcast, her shoulders hunched in on themselves. Lydia watched it all with a growing sense of dread, her heart breaking a little more each day. She wanted to help, to comfort, to understand. But every time she tried to approach Isabella, the girl would shut her out, leaving her standing there with her unanswered questions and her gnawing fear. She started noticing other things too, small things that made her blood run cold. The way Damien would glance at Isabella when he thought no one was looking, the possessive gleam in his eyes. The way his hand would linger on her shoulder a little too long, the way he would stand just a little too close, the way Isabella would flinch, her face paling whenever he was near. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Lydia watched them carefully. Isabella picked at her food, her eyes glued to her plate, her hands trembling slightly as she moved the fork back and forth. Damien was in high spirits, talking animatedly about his campaign, his voice full of confidence and charm. "And when I'm elected," he was saying, his eyes glinting with ambition, "I'll make sure this town becomes the shining example of progress and prosperity." Isabella said nothing, her fork slipping from her fingers and clattering against her plate. She jumped at the sound, her eyes darting nervously to Damien, as if expecting him to explode. Lydia's heart ached at the sight. "Isabella, are you all right?" she asked gently, reaching out to touch her arm. Isabella pulled away, her face contorting in fear. "I'm fine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I need to go to my room." Damien's eyes flicked to Isabella, a muscle in his jaw ticking as he set his fork down. "Stay," he said softly, his voice carrying an undertone of command. "You haven't finished your dinner." Isabella froze, her eyes wide and fearful, her hands clenching in her lap. She glanced at Lydia, her expression pleading, desperate. But Lydia didn't know what to do, how to help. She could only watch, helpless, as the power dynamic between father and daughter played out before her eyes. "Stay," Damien repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You need to eat." Isabella nodded slowly, picking up her fork with trembling hands. She forced herself to take a bite, her eyes fixed on her plate, her body trembling. After dinner, Isabella retreated to her room without a word, leaving Lydia and Damien alone in the dining room. Lydia stared at her empty plate, her mind racing with all the things she wanted to say, to ask. But the words wouldn't come. They stuck in her throat, lodged there by fear and doubt. Damien watched her, his gaze cool and calculating. "You look troubled," he said finally, his voice smooth and detached. "Is something bothering you?" Lydia glanced up at him, searching his eyes for some hint of the man she had once loved. But all she saw was a stranger, someone she didn't recognize. "It's Isabella," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "She's not herself. Something's wrong." Damien's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "She's a teenager," he said dismissively. "They go through phases. She'll be fine." Lydia shook her head, her chest tightening with a mix of anger and fear. "No, it's more than that. She's scared. I can see it in her eyes." Damien's jaw tightened, his fingers tapping against the table. "You're overreacting," he said coldly. "Isabella is fine. You're just imagining things." Lydia stared at him, her mind whirling with suspicion and dread. Was she imagining it? Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The signs were all there, screaming at her to do something, to find out the truth. But she had to know. She had to find out what was happening to her daughter, to protect her, to save her from whatever darkness was creeping into their lives. Late one night, after everyone had gone to bed, Lydia crept into the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. She moved quietly, her hands shaking as she reached for the small camera she had purchased that day. She hesitated for a moment, a wave of guilt and fear washing over her. Was this the right thing to do? Was she invading her daughter's privacy, crossing a line? But then she remembered the fear in Isabella's eyes, the way she flinched whenever Damien was near, and her resolve hardened. She needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. She had to protect her daughter. She slipped into Isabella's room, the camera clutched tightly in her hand. She placed it carefully on the bookshelf, angling it just right so that it would capture the entire room. Then she turned and left, closing the door quietly behind her. Lydia spent the next few days in a state of anxious anticipation, her nerves fraying with every passing hour. She avoided Damien as much as possible, keeping to herself, her mind consumed with worry and fear. She had to know. She had to see what was happening when she wasn't around. Finally, the day came when she retrieved the camera, her hands shaking as she slipped it into her pocket. She locked herself in the bathroom, her heart racing as she pressed play, the screen flickering to life. What she saw made her blood run cold. Damien, slipping into Isabella's room in the dead of night, his hands reaching for her as she slept. The way she woke with a start, her eyes wide with terror, her body going rigid as he touched her, his hands roaming over her small frame. The way he whispered to her, his lips brushing against her ear, his fingers trailing down her arm, her back. Lydia's stomach churned, bile rising in her throat as she watched, as she saw the truth unfold before her eyes. She felt a scream building in her chest, a scream of rage, of horror, of betrayal. but it stuck in her throat, lodged there by the sheer weight of the truth. The man she had married, the man she had loved, was a monster. She collapsed against the sink, her body shaking with silent sobs, her mind reeling with the horror of what she had seen. Lydia stood in the living room, her heart pounding in her chest as she waited for Damien to come home. The weight of what she had seen on that camera footage sat heavily on her shoulders, pressing down on her like a physical burden. Her hands shook as she clutched the small device, the damning evidence that had shattered her world. Every fiber of her being screamed to run, to flee from the horror of what was to come, but she stood her ground, knowing that there was no turning back now. The front door creaked open, and Damien walked in, his usual aura of confidence radiating off him. He looked at her with mild surprise, then irritation when he saw the determined set of her jaw, the fiery gleam in her eyes. "Lydia," he began, his voice dripping with false concern. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." She didn't flinch, didn't let the facade drop for even a second. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling but steady. She forced herself to meet his gaze, to hold it. "I know what you've been doing." For a moment, something dark flickered across Damien's face, but then it was gone, replaced by a look of feigned innocence. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said smoothly, taking a step toward her. "Stop!" she snapped, her voice cracking like a whip in the silence of the room. She held up the camera, her hand shaking. "I have proof, Damien. I saw everything." He paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the camera in her hand. A slow, cruel smile spread across his lips, and he let out a low, mocking laugh. "So, you've been spying on me, is that it?" he sneered. "Did you like what you saw?" Lydia's stomach churned, revulsion washing over her. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice thick with disgust. "She's just a child, Damien. Our daughter." He rolled his eyes, waving a dismissive hand. "Spare me the moral high ground, Lydia," he said coldly. "Isabella is not my daughter. She's a stray, a charity case you insisted on bringing into our home." He took a step closer, his eyes gleaming with a twisted satisfaction. "And if I wanted to have a little taste, to see what she's growing into, who are you to stop me?" The room seemed to tilt on its axis, and Lydia felt a wave of nausea rise up in her throat. She stared at him, horrified, unable to comprehend the monstrosity of his words. "You're sick," she choked out. "You're a monster." Damien's smile widened, his eyes dark and mocking. "Oh, please," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Don't act so shocked. You knew what you married, or at least you should have." Lydia's vision blurred with tears of rage and despair. "I will not let you hurt her again," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "I will not let you do this to our family." He laughed again, a cold, heartless sound that cut through her like a blade. "What family, Lydia?" he spat. "You're nothing but a barren woman clinging to a lie, and she's just a toy. A toy I'm quite enjoying, I might add." Her knees threatened to buckle beneath her, but she forced herself to stay upright, to stay strong. "You're leaving this house," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "You're leaving, and you're never coming near us again." Damien's face twisted in rage, and he took a step toward her, his hand raised as if to strike. "You think you can order me around, you worthless—" "Don't touch her!" a voice screamed, and suddenly Isabella was there, throwing herself between them, her small frame standing as a barrier between her mother and the monster that was her father. Damien stopped, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at her, his hand still poised to strike. "You little brat," he hissed. "You think you can defy me after everything I've done for you?" Isabella stood her ground, her body trembling, but her eyes were filled with a fierce, desperate determination. "You won't hurt her," she said, her voice shaking. "I won't let you." Lydia felt a surge of pride and terror for her daughter. She reached out, grabbing Isabella's arm, pulling her back protectively. "Stay behind me, sweetie," she whispered, her eyes never leaving Damien's face. Damien's eyes blazed with fury, and he lunged forward, but Lydia was ready. She stepped in front of Isabella, her hand striking out and catching him across the face with a force that surprised even her. He staggered back, his hand flying to his cheek, his eyes wide with shock. "Don't you dare touch her," Lydia growled, her voice low and dangerous. "Don't you dare come near us again." He straightened, his face contorting with rage, but he hesitated, his eyes flickering to the camera still clutched in her hand. "What are you going to do, Lydia?" he sneered. "You think anyone will believe you? You think they'll care?" Lydia's hand shook, but her grip on the camera tightened. "I'll make them care," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "I'll show them this. I'll show them what you really are." Damien's face paled, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He took a step back, his hands raising in a placating gesture. "Now, let's not be hasty," he said, his tone suddenly conciliatory. "There's no need to make this public. We can work this out, just between us." "No," Lydia snapped, her voice cold and unyielding. "There's no working this out. You're leaving and you're not coming back. Ever." He glared at her, his eyes dark with fury and something else, defeat. He looked at Isabella, then back at Lydia, and his lips curled into a snarl. "You'll regret this," he spat. "You'll both regret this." Lydia felt a shiver run down her spine, but she held her ground, her eyes blazing with defiance. "Get out," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "Get out, and don't ever come back." Damien stood there for a moment, his chest heaving with rage, his fists clenched at his sides. But then he turned, storming out of the house without another word, the door slamming shut behind him. The silence that followed was deafening, the air heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Lydia stood there, her body trembling, her mind reeling. She felt Isabella's arms wrap around her, the girl's small body shaking with silent sobs. "It's over," Lydia whispered, holding her daughter close, her own tears finally breaking free. "It's over." But even as she said the words, she knew the truth. It wasn't over. Not really, it would never be over, not until Damien was behind bars, far away from them, unable to hurt them ever again. And even then, the scars he had left would remain, a permanent reminder of the nightmare they had survived. But for now, in this moment, they were safe. They were together. And that was enough. Lydia sat on the edge of Isabella's bed, the silence between them heavy, almost unbearable. It was late, the room dimly lit by the bedside lamp. She had tried to keep her tears at bay, but now they slipped down her cheeks, one after another, as she looked at her daughter. Isabella sat curled up in the corner of the bed, her knees drawn to her chest, eyes hollow and far away. "I'm so sorry, Isabella." Lydia's voice broke as she reached out, but stopped herself, not wanting to startle the girl. "I should have protected you. I should have known. I should have done something." Isabella remained silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on the blanket, her fingers absent-mindedly twisting a loose thread. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper, fragile yet filled with a sorrow that seemed far too deep for a child her age. "You couldn't have known," she said, her eyes slowly lifting to meet her mother's. He said he would hurt you if I told anyone. He said he would make you disappear, and then he'd come for me." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hugged her knees tighter, her small body trembling. Lydia felt like her heart was being ripped from her chest. The thought of her little girl carrying that burden, of living in such terror. It was too much. "Isabella," she choked out, her voice filled with anguish. "You shouldn't have had to protect me. I'm your mother. I'm supposed to keep you safe." "But I was scared," Isabella whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks now, mirroring her mother's. "I was so scared, Mom. And he said no one would believe me because I'm just the adopted kid, that people would think I made it up." Lydia couldn't hold back anymore. She reached out and gathered Isabella into her arms, holding her tightly as they both sobbed. "It's not your fault," she murmured, pressing her lips to her daughter's hair. "None of this is your fault. You're safe now, sweetie. I promise you, he's never going to hurt you again." Isabella clung to her, crying until she had no tears left, her small body shaking with the force of her emotions. Lydia held her, rocking her gently, whispering reassurances, even as a fierce anger boiled inside her. Damien had threatened them both, had twisted his evil into their lives, and she had been blind to it. But no more. She would fight for Isabella. She would make sure he paid for every ounce of pain he had caused. But the scars Damien had left were not just physical. The weeks that followed his arrest were filled with a haunting kind of silence that settled over their lives. Isabella was a shadow of her former self, withdrawing from the world around her, fearful and distrustful. Lydia did her best to coax her back into the light, but it was slow, agonizing work. One afternoon, she got a call from Isabella's school. Her heart sank as the principal's voice came through the line, grave and concerned. "Mrs. Sanchez, there's been an incident involving Isabella." Lydia arrived at the school, her mind racing with worry. She was led to the principal's office, where she found Isabella sitting in a chair, her face pale, her hands clenching the fabric of her skirt. Beside her sat a boy from her class, a bandage on his forehead, his eyes wide and bewildered. "What happened?" Lydia asked, her voice tight with fear. The principal cleared her throat. "It seems there was a misunderstanding. One of Isabella's classmates, thinking it was a harmless joke, came up behind her and covered her eyes with his hands. Isabella reacted strongly." Lydia looked at Isabella, who stared at the floor, her eyes distant. "What do you mean, reacted strongly?" "She hit him," the principal said carefully, "with her phone. He needed stitches." Lydia's heart twisted painfully. "Oh, Isabella!" The boy's mother spoke up then, her voice sharp with anger. "Your daughter attacked my son for no reason." Lydia turned to face her, feeling the weight of the accusation, but also the protectiveness rising within her. "I'm sure there's more to this than you know," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "Isabella has been through a lot." "I don't care what she's been through," the woman snapped. "She assaulted my child." "Enough," the principal interjected, holding up a hand. "This is a sensitive situation for all involved. We need to approach it with understanding." Lydia knelt beside Isabella, who still hadn't looked up. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "can you tell me what happened?" Isabella's lip trembled. I thought he was..." She broke off, her breathing quickening, her hands clenching tighter. "I was scared, Mom. I thought he was going to..." Lydia's heart broke all over again. She wrapped her arms around Isabella, holding her close. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're okay. You're safe." The principal sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Mrs. Sanchez, I think it's clear that Isabella is dealing with some serious trauma. She needs professional help." With each passing day, Lydia saw more of the depth of the wounds Damien had inflicted. Isabella couldn't stand to be near men, even boys her own age. She recoiled from physical contact, flinched at loud noises, and suffered from nightmares that left her screaming in the dark. It became painfully clear that they couldn't stay in Almendros. The town was suffocating them. The constant whispers, the reporters who camped outside their home, hungry for a story. Damien's arrest had been a media sensation. The town's golden man, the man who was supposed to be their next mayor, revealed to be a monster. Every day, the headlines screamed his name, and every day, Isabella's anxiety grew. She couldn't go outside without someone pointing, whispering. Lydia knew they had to leave. They needed a fresh start. So they packed their things and moved to a new city. A place where no one knew their story, where they could blend in, and Isabella could begin to heal without the prying eyes of the world around her. Lydia found a quiet neighborhood, enrolled Isabella in a new school, and sought out the best therapists to help her daughter navigate the dark waters of her trauma. The healing process was slow, a journey filled with setbacks and small victories. Isabella struggled, but she also began to find strength she didn't know she had. With time and support, she started to open up in therapy, to talk about what had happened, to release the pain she'd been holding inside. Lydia watched as her daughter slowly began to reclaim her life, her spirit rekindling with each passing day. There were moments of joy, moments when Isabella would laugh, and for a brief instant, the shadow that hung over her would lift. She made friends at school, began to engage in activities she used to love, her passion for life slowly returning. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the darkness seemed too much to bear. But they faced it together, mother and daughter, hand in hand. Months passed, and the nightmares became less frequent. Isabella no longer flinched at every sound, no longer feared every shadow. She started to smile more, to laugh without reservation. Lydia watched in awe as her daughter blossomed, turning into the bright, beautiful young girl she was always meant to be. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of their new home, Isabella turned to Lydia, her eyes shining with a light that hadn't been there in so long. "Mum," she said softly. "Thank you." Lydia blinked, surprised. "For what, sweetheart?" Isabella reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "For believing me. For saving me." Lydia's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled Isabella into a tight embrace. "I love you," she whispered. "I'll always protect you." And as they sat there, the past slowly fading into the background, they knew they had found something precious. They had found hope. They had found each other. And that was enough to begin again. Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. I know today's story was really intense and difficult to hear, but it's a powerful reminder of something important. Even though this was a fictional tale, the reality is that many children around the world go through similar horrors. And what's truly heartbreaking is that often the person causing the harm is someone they know, someone they should be able to trust. As parents, guardians, or just members of a community, we need to be vigilant and protective of our children, whether they're boys or girls. We need to create an environment where they feel safe and heard. It's so crucial to have open communication with them and to be observant of changes in their behavior. Sometimes a child might be too afraid to speak out, and that's where we come in, to watch over them and ensure their safety. I really want to hear your thoughts on this. How do you think we can be more protective and supportive of the kids in our lives? Share your comments below and let's have this important conversation together. Stay safe, everyone.